You know, I don't exactly know when this came to us, but I think as we thought about this volume, and this goes back to your earlier question, you know, about how things are different now than it was 50 years ago with the other two volumes. And, you know, again, when we talked about some of these same concepts that are in the previous volumes around kamaha, ho'oponopono, what we said is, what do we want to say that's different than it was before? And again, for those of you who are familiar with the first two volumes, you know, a lot of the issues around grief and loss, kamaha, was really, they were really about the permanent loss, like some, you know, a child dying or a parent dying, and then all of the rituals and practices around that. And so as we were meeting with each other and also meeting with some, you know, with the staff of the Children's Center and their families, what we know that's a little bit different now is that there is a loss of family members and their ties to each other that is not necessarily through death. It's through serving in the military. It's through drugs. It's through incarceration. And so these family members and friends and neighbors have not, they're not make so that they cannot be in our presence in this bodily form. They're just gone away. And that the grief of having somebody who's actually alive in this body, in this cosmos, but that we cannot connect with them, we cannot be with them, is a little bit different than the teachings of the previous volumes. And so what we said is we want to try to figure out how to say that you can grieve and you have deep grief and deep pain with somebody who hasn't died, but they have disconnected from you or you from them. We talked about domestic violence. We talked about all of these situations in contemporary society that separate us, disconnect us in a deep and sometimes many year period, and sometimes forever, but the person hasn't died except maybe in our connection. And so we said, what do you do? Are you grieving about somebody who's passed, or you're grieving in place as if the person is still with you, but they aren't? And so that's how we kind of came up with this idea of like, you're grieving in the same place that you are, in the same relationship that you are in, but the person is not accessible to you in the same way that they were, and they also have not passed on into a different realm. And it makes the grieving process kind of different. And so that's where we came up with this phrase of grieving in place, that you stay where you are in that relationship, but you cannot connect. And so that I think that's the origin of that. I kind of can't exactly remember all of it, but mahalo, Auntie, for that. And Dennis, I'm sure you remember it maybe a little bit better than I do too.
I think that the grieving place discussion that we had was actually kind of profound, because a lot of our families are facing that, to divorce, and in some ways it's even more difficult to deal with the loss than it is from death, the finality of death. And the loss brings up a lot of interesting feelings that impact on how you relate to others. A lot of times there's anger, depression, and we found that we can use the same principles of ho'oponopono to help the person and the family to work through it. You know, in the concept of ʻoke, where the relationships are cut, parental rights are terminated, but the connection for our children are still there. You know, that's grieving in place, and that's a real issue for our families today. And as we talked about it in the committee, we can help people deal with it using our Hawaiian cultural values and focusing on the individual, particularly children, and how they're dealing with it. So that was one issue I know, Kalei and Lynette, that we said we needed to put on the table because it was probably more prevalent in our time than it was 50 years ago, or whether it wasn't recognized or not, but it was certainly recognized in our time as we did this book.
Dennis mentioned earlier a project taken on by Aha Kane. And with each of the kumu on that project, part of what they were reminded of is the high levels of incidents in the justice system, because that population is increasing. And the question raised was, might ho'oponopono be a viable approach in working with the incarcerated to prepare them for reunification? And that training reached out, I think, nearly 20 students for each trainer. And in learning about ho'oponopono, each of these classes went through that process of self-examination, becoming acquainted with the Hawaiian beliefs and the practices and the rituals, learning about the untangling of hewa, of difficulties, of mistakes. Because those who are incarcerated, often when released, still carry with them that hewa, the knots. And so this was an opportunity to add to the training the knowledge of those that have separated but are still alive, to always look for every child having a family of its own. Is it possible? So we have many more beginning practitioners who recognize the relationships between makua and keiki, mo'opuna with kūpuna. It is important that the practitioner be aware of how ho'oponopono can be utilized to get the parties involved to be ready to engage in ho'oponopono. Because Tūtū says, all connected to the problem must commit to being oia'i'o, to be authentic, to be true, to tell the truth, the absolute truth, and to be sincere and humble, because it requires recognition of what you have done to create pain and hurt and dismantling aloha in the family. It requires self-scrutiny to be able to do this at a deep, genuine level. So, as Dennis mentioned, ho'oponopono is viable for those who grieve in place. And with the efforts of Ahakani, there are more practitioners who are beyond the beginning stage and are really learning it. And I'm glad to say, I've heard feedback from some of my haumana who are the teachers. It's working. They have learned it. They know how to do that. So I just wanted to add a little bit more that with recognizing the numbers have increased with the justice system, we have had Hawaiian groups recognizing that need and putting forth programs to meet the demand for ho'oponopono.
The other thing I meant to say as a coda to both what Auntie just said and also Dennis, is that the other difference between the volumes 1 and 2 and then how we decided to talk about grieving and then ho'oponopono as a healing process of grieving is that, you know, when someone dies, there's a lot of attention on those who are left behind. But with grieving in place, those who are oki from us, they're grieving too. So that's the difference, is that these practices that we talk about in this volume are also for all of us who have been disconnected. So those who are incarcerated, those who are in the military and so far away from their families, those of us who are ill with COVID and we're in the hospital and we're away from our families. So it's not only grieving for those who are left behind, but grieving that those who have left also are grieving too. And so hopefully this volume will give them some tools and some practices and some aloha that they can, as Auntie said, when the time comes for there to be a reconnection, that both parties have done some work for themselves so that they can come back together in a place of aloha and of healing.